In the context of decision-making in organizations, we also need to consider ethics. It's an increasingly important issue as people have more temptations at work than ever before. Our definition of ethical decision-making includes all decisions that have implications for other people. That is, it's difficult to think of business decisions that have no implications that are ethical in nature. Obviously, some decisions have more ethical content than others. We will consider two generally opposing views, utilitarianism and rule-based approaches. Utilitarianism focuses on the outcomes of action, and rule-based approaches on the actions taken. That is, we're going to be seeing utilitarianism as an ends-oriented approach. That is, we care about the consequences of our behavior. And the focus here is on maximization of overall good. That is, the happiness of everybody. John Stuart Mill, some of you may know him from political science, was a famous writer who propounded the approach of utilitarianism in the 1800s. The purpose of moral action, he wrote, is to achieve the greatest overall happiness, and that is, the ends justify the means. We don't need to worry about how the decision is made or what we actually do. We just need to worry about the consequences. But John Stuart Mill, as with everything else, muddied the waters a little bit by providing some guidelines, which we might think of as being rules, to coming up with overall happiness. So his first argument was that everybody's happiness has to be equally important. We can't think that one race or one country or whatever is more important than another. We need to consider future generations. This would apply for resource depletion and climate kinds of issues. We need to consider what the generations that come after. It's not a dictatorship of the majority, so we can't just vote about what goals we would like to achieve or what behaviors we think are ethical. This is one way to prevent things like slavery, which incredible pain and suffering on the part of a few must outweigh a general tendency to think it would be really nice to have some help on the part of the majority. So we can't just vote to come up with the appropriate approach. And that's an important point for John Stuart Mill, because he wanted to make sure that his philosophy, as he was laying it out, was not going to be used as any kind of support for slavery, which of course was legal at the time that he was writing. We need to also include long-term consequences within the individual. So there are things that we do that are not appropriate for us. That is, it may seem like it makes us happier in the short term. As you can see, I've got this picture of a bottle. Might make us happier in the short term. Over the longer term, of course, cirrhosis of the liver suggests that it's not a better outcome. And lastly, the real ringer as far as bringing consequences and rule-based approaches together is that John Stuart Mill had to argue that some pleasures were better than others. So gluttony and lust and acquiring money and so on were not as important as pleasures such as culture and aesthetics and love and beauty and some things like that. So some goals that people have are more important from an ethics standpoint than others. That makes it a little bit more confusing to distinguish between these two approaches. Rule-based approaches, sometimes thought of as deontological approaches. Immanuel Kant was a proponent of rule-based approaches. He talked about the categorical imperative as a way of thinking about this. So the principle of each act under a rule-based approach should be a possible universal law for human action. So if I lie, if I tell you your tie looks nice, then, and I don't think so, then I think the implication of that is that everybody should be able to lie, a universal law of human behavior. This is a very stringent approach, as you'll see as we continue. So rules and principles and reason should guide our action, not our desires. So we've got some examples here in terms of the pictures. We have a constitutional type example, we have religious examples, and we have a business protocol example, right? These are the things that should determine what we do, not what we want. What we want would be much more closely aligned with a consequence or utilitarian approach. Here's the thing that makes this such a stringent model. It argues that nothing is purely good unless the action is taken for the right or moral reason. That is, if I happen to do something correctly, like I don't covet my neighbor's wife, um, fits with the philosophy, fits with the rule. But if I didn't do it for the right reasons because it was a moral reason or a rule, then it's not really purely good behavior. Okay, so between these two approaches, we need to be thinking about where there's an intermediary. But there's one other important idea that we need to throw out here too, because clearly in a multicultural environment, in a global business environment, we need to think about ethical relativism. So some people argue, this is the concept of ethical relativism, some people argue that judgments are all relative to their context. So it's very much opposed to the deontological or rule-based view of universal values. Here we're saying, well, you know, if you're in Rome, do as the Romans do. This is an old adage, of course, but the idea is that if you're in a location, you should abide by the values and beliefs that the location holds as opposed to your own. If we ask ourselves, is this always a good idea, we can very quickly see that it's probably not, that we have to think about the values that we need to uphold regardless of what's going on in the context in which we happen to be. Obviously, it's difficult to separate these very important values from norms of behavior. So if we're in Rome, we may as well eat what Romans do and use the same utensils and try and be polite the way Romans are and so on. But other values that are important to us might not fit in another cultural context. For American businesses, of course, simply doing what's going on in another setting, say American businesses doing business in the Middle East or in India or many other parts of the world, they can get into trouble if they simply go ahead and, for example, pay bribes out in the open. This is against American law as well as typically an American value that, you know, we think bribes are bad. So we can't always just jump in and do what's appropriate in another culture, in particular in business. So ethical relativism is an important idea, but we need to examine our thinking about it very carefully. So how is it that we are going to choose our behaviors? It's not easy, and the responsibility ultimately lies within the individual. But here's some ideas. We need to think about what values and beliefs that you as an individual hold central and don't want to violate. You need to think about the values and beliefs that your organization holds to be central and doesn't want to violate. And then we need to think a little bit about what we can compromise on that doesn't violate such values and beliefs. So an easy one to think of would be the wearing of the headscarf. In many parts of the world, this is a very important religious related belief that this is a tremendous, you know, it's a value, and it's very important to people who believe in it. If I go to the Middle East, am I going to put a scarf on my head? Well, yeah, absolutely, because that's something I can compromise on. I can show respect to the culture that I'm in, doing as the Romans do in that particular case. I can show that respect. It's not an important value or belief to me, although I might think that people don't have the right to tell me that I should wear a headscarf or not. It doesn't really matter to me whether I wear one or not. But it's extremely important to the people who wear them and the people who believe in this. So the compromise is an easy one in that case. I'm going to put the scarf on. Here's some things that we need to do internally. We need to set expectations for our people. If we're managing people, we need to make it clear what we expect in terms of ethical behavior from them. We need to provide training as necessary if it's not clear to people how to behave ethically. If they need to be reminded on a yearly basis, for example, that might be appropriate. And ultimately, we need to hold people accountable. It's very easy to laugh when it seems like something minor. So a guy in a manufacturing environment grabbing his phone and checking the scores for March Madness might seem like a sort of minor incident, even if normally we're not supposed to have our phones out on the production floor. But it actually turns out to be an important value that goes beyond the notion of stealing time from one's company. It's a safety issue because people aren't paying attention when they're looking at their phones. That means that even if it's March Madness, I need to hold people accountable for that rule. If I have that rule and it's about safety, clearly I don't want those implications. The fundamental premise that people often return to at the end of the day on ethics is, if your mother was here, would you do this? Or would you feel okay if you saw your name and this behavior on the front of the Wall Street Journal? If the answer is no in either of those two situations, you might want to think about behaving in a different way.